Just about every organization these days is working on coronavirus contingency plans. Offices, schools, restaurants, sports leagues, and countless others are all looking for ways to do things differently to protect people from the highly infectious disease. To that end, some Massachusetts lawmakers are proposing a major change to this year's elections as well. Widespread mail-in voting. A hearing was held today on Beacon Hill to review proposals that would do just that and expand early voting. Asked about that idea today, Governor Charlie Baker said he was on board, at least for the short term.
I think there are two special elections on May 19th. There are two more in June. There would be no way to have those elections other than to have some sort of mail-in capacity.
But the November presidential election is in question here, too. And while mail-in voting would address safety concerns, some worry it opens the door for security problems in the future. I'm joined now by former Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor Quentin Palfrey. He's now chair of the Group Voter Protection Corps. Welcome, Quentin.
Thanks so much.
It's great to have you. So obviously something has to change. I'm really trying to picture how this is going to work. So people would get, a ballot essentially in the mail. How much in advance of the actual election would they get it? And it's something they would have to read and then mail back in? How would it work?
Yeah, I think that the best way to think about this is we mail a ballot to every registered voter. You also want to give them an opportunity to mail the ballot back, postage prepaid. And then you, of course, need to expand the capacity for processing that voting. But I think it's important to combine those kinds of options with some of the traditional in-person options that we've had in the past. We know that certain kinds of voters are particularly likely to use in-person voting options. So I think you want to expand both your vote-by-mail capacity, your early voting capacity, and your in-person voting capacity.
Obviously, people who are more transient, maybe students or even homeless people, have to show up in person. But what about the potential here for widespread fraud? I mean, it almost seems to me like electronically would be better. If you send, let's say there's 6 adults in a household, one person could open every ballot and check off whatever they wanted. It just seems like it's as opposed to electronic. Have you considered electronic, which you'd have a code, you'd have to enter like you do for a bank account or something?
First, on the question of fraud with the vote by mail, thankfully, we have actually a track record in adopting these kinds of systems in a number of states, both red and blue states. And what we've seen actually is that they've had a fairly high rate of voter turnout and no fraud to speak of. I was speaking last week with the Colorado Secretary of State, which is one of the states that has adopted vote by mail over the last couple of years, and they've seen an increase in voter turnout and only a negligible amount of fraud. So I think that we can manage those challenges.
How would you know? If you sent ballots to a nursing home or to a house that had two parents and then 4 adults, children that could vote, how would you know who filled those ballots out?
Sure. Well, you know the same way you know about any other kind of fraud. You've got law enforcement oversight. The Attorney General's office in Colorado, for example, there are referrals of suspicion of voter fraud to the Attorney General's office that would make an investigation. Anytime you've got a widespread system, there's going to be some abuse. But what's been shown in scholarship around the states that have adopted this, and some of those are red states as well, like Utah has had a very good experience with vote by mail, have shown that this has moved very smoothly. To your question about electronic options, I think it's too soon. So if you see what happened with the Iowa caucuses, for example, when they tried to transition to an app for caucus voting, they tried to do it very quickly, and there were a lot of difficulties that resulted from that. We also do know that foreign governments are interfering in our elections, and that cybersecurity is a real concern. I actually think that we don't want to overthink this. Voting in paper, whether that's by mail or in person, is really the gold standard. You want to keep it simple.
So you've brought up red states, blue states, and I personally don't see what the difference is. But as you know, President Trump feels very strongly that this is a disadvantage to red states or Republicans. Here's a tweet that he sent out. Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to statewide mail-in voting. Democrats are clamoring for it. Tremendous potential for voter fraud, and for whatever reason doesn't work out for Republicans, something he sent to Fox and Friends. Why wouldn't it work out for Republicans? Maybe that's naive. I don't understand how how it would affect Republicans versus Democrats?
So unfortunately, we have a president who has routinely weaponized lies about voter fraud in order to increase obstacles for voting for certain kinds of groups that historically don't vote for Republicans. So President Trump and some of his allies have taken really cynical efforts to try to make it harder for people of color and younger people who move around a lot, to vote. And so to the extent that, efforts that make it fairer to vote, make it harder for President Trump to suppress the vote, I suppose there's a strategic disadvantage there. But what we've seen in red states and in blue states is that reforms that make it easier to vote work just to increase the vote here. And, in the coronavirus time, in the time of this pandemic, I think a lot of the people who are going to have the hardest time voting are going to be senior citizens.
No, absolutely.
And that's a group of people who have historically voted Republican in fairly high numbers, although former Vice President Biden is doing fairly well among that group. It's not at all clear to me that there's a partisan advantage here. There is a huge democracy advantage. So we need to overcome these obstacles.
We have a big race coming up in September, the Democratic primary for Senate. How are these votes going to be counted? Normally, there's a rush that evening. We know, is it going to take days to find out? Will we know on Election Day? When will we find out the results if it's a mail-in vote?
Well, I think it depends on what rules they set on Beacon Hill. I prefer a situation where not only is their postage prepaid, but if the envelope is in the mail postmarked by Election Day, that those votes should count. We saw, for example, in Wisconsin, a few weeks ago, a very badly run election where a number of envelopes didn't get to people and where they didn't have the opportunity to vote at all. I think the best practice is to say that votes that are postmarked by Election Day should count. But if that's the case, it may mean some delays in counting those votes. And I think that that's a trade-off that people on Beacon Hill are going to have to think about. But my personal recommendation is to say that more people are going to have the opportunity to vote if you say a postmark by Election Day is allowed.
All right. Well, let's hope something happens soon because we got a bunch of elections coming up. All right. Quentin Palfrey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.